Moosehead Lake is a suitably wild-looking sheet of water, sprinkled with small, low islands, which were covered with shaggy spruce and other wild wood. The scenery is not merely wild, but varied and interesting. Mountains farther or nearer, on all sides but the northwest. Paddling along the eastern side of the lake in the still of the morning, we saw a few sheldrakes and some peetweets. We also saw and heard loons. We had a glorious view of the broad lake with its fluctuating surface and numerous forest-clad islands extending beyond our sight both north and south, and the boundless forest undulating away from its shores on every side, as densely packed as a rye field, and enveloping nameless mountains in succession. It was a perfect lake of the woods. If I wished to see the mountains or other scenery under the most favorable auspices, I would go to it in foul weather, so as to be there when it cleared up. We are then in the most suitable mood, and nature is most fresh and inspiring. The course we took over this lake, and others afterward, was rarely direct, but a succession of curves from point to point, digressing considerably into each of the bays. It was inspiriting to hear the regular dip of the paddles, as if they were our fins or flippers. The next thing was to get our canoe and effects over the carry from this lake into the Penobscot River. This railway from the lake into the river occupied the middle of a clearing 2 or 3 rods wide and perfectly straight through the forest. We walked across while our baggage was drawn behind. There was a very slight rise above the lake, and at length a gradual descent to the Penobscot, which I was surprised to find here a large stream, from 12 to 15 rods wide, flowing from west to east, or at a right angle with the lake, no more than 2.5 miles from it. While my companions were seeking a suitable spot for camp, I improved the little daylight that was left in climbing alone. What is most striking in the Maine wilderness is the continuousness of the forest, with fewer open intervals or glades than you had imagined. I had soon cleared the trees and paused on successive shelves to look back over the country. The kings of England formerly had their forests to hold the king's game, for sport or food, sometimes destroying villages to create or extend them, and I think they were impelled by a true instinct. Why should not we, who have renounced the king's authority, have our national preserves, where no villages need be destroyed, in which the bear and the panther, and some even of the hunter race, may still exist, and not be civilized off the face of the earth? Our forests, not to hold the king's game merely, but for inspiration and our own true recreation. At length I reached an elevation sufficiently bare to afford a view of the summit of Mount Katahdin, still distant and blue, almost as if retreating from me, and I looked up at this blue barrier as if it were some fragment of a wall which anciently bounded the earth in that direction. Sometimes it seemed as if the summit would be cleared in a few moments, but what was gained on one side was lost on another. It was like sitting in a chimney and waiting for the smoke to blow away. It was, in fact, a cloud factory. These were the cloud works. Setting the compass for a northeast course, I was soon buried in the woods. There are three classes of inhabitants who either frequent or inhabit the country I now entered. First, the hunters, mostly Indians, who ranged over it in their season. Second, the few settlers, the only permanent inhabitants, who live on the verge of it. Third, the loggers, who are far the most numerous, but in the summer, except a few explorers for timber, completely deserted. In the thickest of the wood, I saw an empty loggers' camp, still new, which was occupied the previous winter. These were such houses as the lumberers of Maine spend the winter in the wilderness. Strange that so few ever come to the woods to see how the pine lives and grows and spires, lifting its evergreen arms to the light, to see its perfect success. Most are content to behold it in the shape of many broad boards brought to market, and deem that is its true success. There is a higher law affecting our relation to pines, as well as to men. Every creature is better alive than dead, men and moose and pine trees, and he who understands it aright will rather preserve its life than destroy it. I have been into the lumber yard and the carpenter's shop and the turpentine clearing, but when at length I saw the tops of the pines waving and reflecting the light at a distance high over all the rest of the forest, I realized that it is the living spirit of the tree and not its spirit of turpentine with which I sympathize. It is as immortal as I am, and perchance will go to as high a heaven, there to tower above me still. It is a country full of evergreen trees, of mossy silver birches and watery maples, and strewn with damp and moss-grown rocks. I believed that the woods were not tenantless, but choke-full of honest spirits as good as myself any day. Not an empty chamber in which chemistry was left to work alone, but an inhabited house, and for a few moments I enjoyed fellowship with them. This was the sort of garden which I made my way over, at the risk, it is true, of treading on some of the plants, not seeing any path through it. Certainly the most treacherous and porous country I ever traveled. The surface of the ground in the Maine woods is everywhere spongy and saturated with moisture. The walking grew rapidly worse, and the path more indistinct. The trail was almost obliterated, being no more than a muskrat leaves in similar places, when he parts the floating sedge. If you want an exact recipe for making such a road, take 1 part mud pond and dilute it with equal parts of moosehead and penobscot. Then send a family of muskrats through to locate it, look after the grades and culverts, and finish it to their minds, and let a hurricane follow to do the fencing. As it was, I would not have missed that walk for a good deal. At the north end of the carry, in the midst of a clearing of 60 acres or more, there was a log camp of the usual construction for the accommodation of the carryman's family and passing lumberers. When I returned to my companions, they had selected a camping ground on the torrent's edge and were resting on the ground. You commonly make your camp just at sundown and are collecting wood, getting your supper, or pitching your tent while the shades of night are gathering around and adding to the already dense gloom of the forest. By the time the bed is made, the water boils, the pork is fried, and supper is ready. I lay awake a while, watching the ascent of the sparks through the firs. They were as interesting as fireworks, going up in endless, successive crowds in an eager serpentine course above the treetops before they went out. We do not suspect how much our chimneys have concealed, how airtight stoves have come to conceal all the rest. It was very agreeable as well as independent, thus lying in the open air, and the fire kept our uncovered extremities warm enough. The Jesuit missionaries used to say that in their journeys with the Indians in Canada, they lay on a bed which had never been shaken up since creation, unless by earthquakes. But at length we composed ourselves seriously to sleep. At night, the general stillness is more impressive than any sound. It has left such an impression of stern yet gentle wildness on my memory as will not soon be effaced. When next we awoke, there were signs of dawn in the east. We had soon launched and loaded our boat and were off again before breakfast. These 20 miles of the Penobscot, between Moosehead and Chesuncook lakes, are comparatively smooth and a great part dead water, but from time to time it is shallow and rapid, with rocks or gravel beds where you can wade across. The banks are from 6 to 10 feet high, but once or twice rise gently to higher ground. In many places, the forest on the bank was but a thin strip, letting the light through from some alder swamp or meadow behind. About a mile downstream, when the solitude seemed to be growing more complete every moment, we suddenly saw the light and heard the crackling of a fire on the bank and discovered the camp of explorers, they standing before it in red shirts and talking aloud of the adventures and profits of the day. They were going to the neighborhood of Eagle and Chamberlain lakes, or to the headwaters of the St. John. They offered to keep us company as far as we went. They searched for timber over a given section, climbing hills and often high trees to look off, explore the streams by which it is to be driven and the like, spend 5 or 6 weeks in the woods, they alone, 100 miles or so from any town, roaming about and sleeping on the ground where night overtakes them, depending chiefly on the provisions they carry with them, though they do not decline what game they come across. In the fall, they return and make report to their employers, determining the number of teams that will be required the following winter. It is a solitary and adventurous life, and comes nearest to that of the trapper of the West, perhaps. They work ever with a gun as well as an axe, and live without neighbors, not on an open plain, but far within a wilderness. After paddling about 2 miles, we parted company with the explorers and turned up Lobster Stream. This was the last we saw of them, though I have often wished that I was with them. Lobster Stream was 6 or 8 rods wide and appeared to run nearly parallel with the Penobscot. It was so called from small freshwater lobsters found in it. This is a very meandering stream, but comparatively deep. It was bordered here and there by narrow meadows between the stream and the endless forest, affording favorable places for the moose to feed. We proceeded half a mile up this as through a narrow, winding canal, where the tall, dark spruce and firs and arborvitae towered on both sides, forming a perpendicular forest edge of great height. We thought of the day when this might be a brook winding through smooth-shaven meadows on some gentleman's grounds. Excepting the forest that now hems it in, how little changed it would appear. We soon reached a small meadow on the east side at an angle in the stream. As we were advancing along the edge of this, rather more quietly than usual, on account of the freshness of the signs, suddenly we spied 2 moose, not more than 6 or 7 rods distant. They are the true denizens of the forest. Moose men, wood eaters, the word is said to mean, clad in a sort of Vermont gray or homespun. They made me think of great frightened rabbits with their long ears and half inquisitive, half frightened looks. Earlier in the season, the hunters steal upon them as they are feeding along the sides of the stream, and often the first notice they have of one is the sound of the water dripping from the muzzle. We saw many times what to our imaginations looked like a gigantic moose, with his horns peering out the forest edge. But we saw the forest only, and not its inhabitants. There were very few sounds to break the stillness. The moose will perhaps one day become extinct, but how naturally then, when it exists only as a fossil relic and unseen as that, may the poet or sculptor invent a fabulous animal with similar branching and leafy horns to be the inhabitant of such a forest as this. After ascending about 1.5 miles to within a short distance of Lobster Lake, we returned to the Penobscot.